let's put our hands together and welcome you to our virtual stage. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, Sarah. Yes, we're going down to Cornwall in the southwest of England for this talk, but we're going to be talking about the United Nations Resource Management System. I'm not quite sure how many people actually know about this system yet. It was introduced in around 2019 as built out from the United Nations Framework Classification Scheme, which I think Tom Bai did a talk on a few years ago at Responsible Raw Materials. So if you want an introduction to that, I would go see Tom's talk by searching for it on the website. But the UNRMS is really trying to take it that one step further. So today I just want to kind of give you a bit of an introduction as to what it is and how we've been applying it to Southwest England. So Southwest England is one of those places that's had a very long mining history, quite a pause in mining activity, but is being looked at again as a source of critical raw materials. And really, as it's being re-looked at, we want to make sure that if industry does come back to the area, that it happens in the right way, in a responsible way, and that all of the mistakes of the past, which we can still see on the ground today in the Southwest, aren't made again. And so we've been looking at the United Nations Resource Management System as a way of maybe being able to manage that. So yeah, we'll give it a go. The first thing to note about it is it's another principles-based system. And in a way that's quite good, because at the moment it's got a lot of flexibility to it. It's still in development, so it's not set in stone. So while we've been doing this case study, it's one of the first applications. We've kind of been finding our way through it, seeing kind of how you would begin to apply it. And I'm sure some of these principles are quite recognisable. There's that transparency and competency. Those are in the CRISCO codes, definitely there. But it really takes that broader framework around like who's responsible for minerals in an area, what responsibility do we have to the planet, do we have to the people in that area, to the workers, to the local communities, but also on a more global scale, how do we go towards sort of sustainable minerals management for the green transition, combating climate change. There's a lot of normative reference in here to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, and how do we have action on those whilst using natural resources. It is a hefty document, I'm not going to lie. It's 12 principles and there are 54 underlying requirements, which when talking to people not in our sphere and who are not nerds, can be quite a challenge. So we've been trying to help condense this a little bit and give people a bit more of a flavour of what it's trying to do. So they want it to be a global voluntary standard for a range of organisations. Again, there's that flexibility. It's for governments, it's for businesses, it's for local stakeholders, NGOs, anyone who's kind of involved in resource management space. It's around innovative and integrated resource management. So although my passion is critical raw materials, I am a geologist, got to love the rocks. But the idea behind this is building on that UNFC, that United Nations Framework Classification, which classifies any type of resource and where they are in their pipeline. So that can be wind energy, geothermal, oil and gas are in there. You name it, anything that we classify as a natural resource, you can probably fit within that UNFC criteria and start to think of it on that holistic basis, how those different resources mesh together, what are the synergies. It is that they want a comprehensive information framework methodology that supports that sustainable resource management at a variety of scales. So you could probably apply this for this case that I'm going to talk about in a moment for Southwest England. We've done it on a regional basis. You could do it on a national basis. I mean, if you had everyone involved, you could probably do it on a global basis, but it would be very complicated. So it's really trying to get that scalability and understanding the complex systems that we live and work within. And really, it's back to the kind of environmental, social, and economic objectives. It's like, how do we value our projects? How do we value resources? And how do we make sure that different projects are being compared in the right way and with the right metrics? Again, long-term consideration, Sustainable Development Goals, climate change action, they're future events. This is about long-term planning. We also know with minerals deposits, it takes a long time to get those from kind of idea into production. So how do you start building that into your governance systems? And again, with that kind of harnessing those integrated dynamic capabilities. How do you build value chains that support the sustainable development goals? Where should you have your processing? Should we have processing being funneled to certain areas of the world, or should it be on a more local basis? And where is that value add happening, and how do we interact with different nations when we want our critical raw materials? So it's a lofty ambition, and we've tried to at least have a go at implementing it on one very small area to start with, and with an even smaller focus on technology critical metals projects. The reason why we're focusing on this is because as my day-to-day, before I kind of expanded into the United Nations Resource Management System, I'm a researcher on this Met4Tech project, which is the Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Centre for Technology Metals, which is hosted at the University of Exeter. And really what I'm doing there is looking at circularity, technology critical metals, and how you can get circularity ideas into the early exploration and mining aspects of our supply chains. And we sort of then build out from this with a bit of work we were doing with the local enterprise partnerships. So they set the economic strategy for this and industrial strategy for the southwest of England. They wanted a bit of information on what was going on in Cornwall. Everyone was talking about it. It was mentioned in the UK's critical mineral strategy, but actually, where are those projects and how do they link with each other, and what support should regional governments put in place to help these projects develop? And should they be putting measures and support to help them develop, or should they just leave it up to the companies to do it themselves? And in doing that, we had to basically do a review of, well, what do we have? What do we classify as a georesource? And how do you begin to link all of these things together so that you have strong regional sustainable development and that real supporting framework going forward? And when you really start to look at georesources across a region, you soon realise that it's not just the metals that are under exploration at the time. In the southwest of England, where we are, there's also a big heritage aspect to it. We've got a UNESCO World Heritage Site that brings in visitor economy, tourist attractions, those kind of aspects. We've got a fantastic, the geomorphology is great for floating offshore wind. There's ideas for floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea. They've got plenty of solar panels around, plenty of wind turbines. There's ideas around geothermal energy as well, harnessing kind of heat from the granites. We're also then looking into kind of our legacy and background. We've got a lot of skills that have built up over the time, being a past mining district. So how do you harness that going forward? And really, we are sitting on the legacy of mining. So we had 4,000 years of mining in the southwest of England. Where is that tin now? How come we're dealing still to this day with the environmental cleanup associated with the past legacy? And how, if we do it again, do we avoid all of that challenging aspect with using natural resources? So the first thing we did is we classified the resource projects just to kind of get an idea of where they are, who's close to development, who's far from development, and really trying to just articulate, okay, we've got these projects, saying that there's a gold rush for lithium in the area, fair enough, but where is that project in the area? Like, how far away from production is it? And when it's in production, how much could it produce? Because that really is what local governments, regional, national governments need to set strategy. And strategy is quite important when you're doing forward planning, especially if you've got public monies that you're trying to support developing a skills base, figuring out what you're going to be teaching in schools and colleges, where to invest in your infrastructure, grid capacity, all of those long-term planning aspects that are kind of out of the hands of the individual projects, but when you add them all up together, have quite a significant impact. We're also talking about circularity when we're going forward. How do you actually begin to build these systems? If we want a circular economy, what do you have to put in place? It's not just about digging the material out, it's about how you use it. And it's also about how you resource it. Do you have clean energy supplies? Is there a potential for using hydrogen in your power plants? What other aspects of your supply chain, value chain, regional business ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, what do you have to put in place? And that's where the United Nations Resource Management System kind of came into its own in a little bit of a sense for this. So we've rejigged it a little bit from that flowchart that I showed at the start into this slightly more, well, it's a diagram where we can quickly pick out the E, the S and the G of ESG and the economics part, which is that circular economy. And really, we can start to use the UNRMS as that toolkit for how do you do sustainable development? What do you need to do? How do you begin to bring ideas together to kind of put those next steps in place? So first things first is, what are the priorities? Who's involved? Who's got responsibility for the management of resources? That can actually be a lot more complicated than, oh, it's the local government, they've got charge. It's usually there's a few more complexities in there usually. Environment responsibility to the planet, social responsibility to people, health and safety, social contract on natural resources, governance, that's really around that management of resources. How do we know what we've got in the ground? That's where the Crisco codes are really important. And then that circular economy aspect, service orientation, comprehensive resource recovery. What do we want to do going forward and have that value going into the communities that are directly impacted? And really, this is all underlined by what we've termed these facilitating principles, which is where you need competency and capability building and strengthening. You need transparency in that trust base, and you need innovation. So we applied this to Cornwall. We've got the Cornwall and Ardersley Industrial Strategy. And really, it wants to be a carbon neutral economy. And georesources is a facet of this. So we had a look at it and tried to understand, okay, what is the Southwest doing well, and what is it doing less well in this framework? And what we've kind of identified is that, well, the UK, for example, is really quite good at health and safety. We've got a strong health and safety inspectorate. There's good reporting on it generally. I mean, we don't have the industries working in this area in quite such a big way yet, but that's something that we're not as concerned with as perhaps something like talent pipeline development. Do we actually have the people in the Southwest with the skills to actually take advantage if this new kind of business cluster takes off? Do we have central reporting and data provision? Is that transparent? What about infrastructure? What are the plans for that? Those are all things that could potentially be improved on. And we put it into a fairly simple matrix in the end of the day, just to sort of articulate this to people who aren't, again, the nerds. And it's really around, okay, if we're going to have innovation, transparency, competency and capability building across all of these sectors, what are the kinds of things that we can put in place? So for Cornwall, we thought about training in systems thinking and building the talent pipeline and having those roadmaps going forward, and thinking about having strategic environmental assessments of like combined impact looking forward and those kind of aspects, and really trying to articulate that when you're looking at resources, you can't just focus on one thing and do that one thing well. It's really a broad spectrum of pieces that you need to move into place to have sustainable development. So I'm going to be finishing up here because we're still in progress with this work. So it's kind of like the highlights bit of it. But really, we found the resource management system quite useful because of its flexibility. You can sort of adapt it at the moment to articulate the problem, really. And we've managed to articulate some recommendations that we hope will be taken forward. Fingers crossed, we'll see. Watch this space, basically, on that. But really, it's a way of talking about resources and kind of bringing it out from the project and really seeing it as a network of things going forward and having that forward planning. So I think, yeah, a useful tool if you want my takeaway on it. And I will stop sharing there.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Eva. That was a fantastic overview of what is an incredibly complicated world of not only acronyms, but also lots and lots of different people coming together. So round of applause, please, everyone, for the fabulous Eva. Thank you very much. Great. So I've got a number of different questions that are coming in here at the moment. And by the way, everybody, please do feel free to keep them coming. If we don't manage to ask them to the fabulous speaker, then we'll try and sneak them in later during the panel session, or at least certainly address them during the conference. So Eva, in terms of what you just showed to us, it feels like this UNRMS is huge in terms of what it's trying to encompass. I mean, everything from wind through to oil and gas. This is a huge variety of natural resources, effectively, that could be shared. Is it possible to do UNRMS in little bits rather than all together, or really does the beauty of it only fall into place when you see everything as a system?
I think it depends on the stakeholder who's wanting to use it.
Okay.
Because it's not going to work in the same way for every nation or every area, because every area has the different resources. So you might not have some of these aspects. So it is nice and flexible. There is beauty to it if you manage to apply it on a huge level. It would be fantastic. I'm not sure how feasible that is at the moment. At the moment, I think it would just be baby steps in a way, building up some case studies, figuring out how it works for different resources to start with, and kind of adding the complexity as we go forward. I do think there's something to be said for embracing the complexity of it in a way. And as Katie said in the previous talk, there is definitely something around just having a go at something, even if you haven't defined it quite yet, because the principles are the same. The principles are pretty all-encompassing, and as long as you're kind of working towards them, well, at least you're working towards them. If you don't have them quite perfect yet, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, I think you just got to give it a go at this point. It's still early days. We're not quite, I have only applied it on the regional level. It would be great to see a variety of different case studies looking at it on different levels to see kind of where it works, where it doesn't work going forward.
Also,
sorry, non-answer, but
no, it's great. The challenge has been set, and actually there's already a research project that has just messaged me to say that they're going to take this and then run a test through their research that they're doing. So yes, from an academic perspective, but I think that's great. Yeah. So other people sucking it and seeing. Just from this then, Eva, who's actually driving all of this? Is this like is this governments? Is this geological surveys? Is this the UN, or is this industry? So who wants it?
Who wants it and who's in the room? Yeah. Okay. So the history to this, which I probably should have mentioned a little bit more. So it was the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe developed the United Nations Framework Classification Scheme. Sorry, there are many long titles in this. And basically they started on that work quite a while ago. That's been going for at least 15 years, if not more, on that framework classification scheme that came out of the oil and gas industry, basically. And that was where they tried to classify resources and harmonize the classification of resources. And then it's kind of, as time has progressed, as with most resources, that E and the S kind of aspects and the governance aspects have become more and more to the fore. And so they decided, okay, with the coming in of the sustainable development goals, how do we have a system that basically allows people to talk about resources whilst going towards achieving the sustainable development goals? So it was really driven by the UN ECE's, I think it's their expert group on raw materials, which have basically been leading with this, and Harry and Charlotte there have been real drivers behind this. To date, it has mostly been driven by the geological surveys. The UNFC, that framework classification scheme, really has been in their court for a long time and seems to work really well there, especially when it comes to kind of governments and countries looking at their resource base and being able to understand what they've got on the ground in their patch, basically. It could be used by industry. I know that some companies are beginning to look at it around like tailings resources potentially. It's been used in a few case studies there to see how that will work going forward, because it's that little bit more flexible than the Crisco codes. But again, there still needs to be some harmonization across those and making sure that all that reporting is aligned and working well together. But then the UNRMS, again, it's driven by the UN, some interest from certain countries and regions and geological surveys. Probably one to keep an eye on is the African mining vision, because they've been looking at it quite a lot of detail, and it is kind of set in the basis of some of their work that's ongoing at the moment. So yeah, I'm not sure. It is meant to be for everybody, but there are certain areas that I think it will work better, basically.
And I think this is, I mean, if you're trying to design something that is everything to everybody, It's going to be really difficult. And I don't know, Roger, if you want to comment on this at all, because I know that you have been involved, and especially bridging, you know, kind of making sure that the Crisco side of things and everything that Eva's just been talking about, actually there is a connection there. I don't know, Roger, if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, Eva, that was fantastic. You've enlightened me. I've been involved with the UNECE for about 20 years, and in the recent past, you know, the introduction of this UNRMS has always mystified me. I've never known quite what it was. At least now, when I've listened to you, I've got some understanding of where it is. Yeah, as you say, it's got a long way to go, and the thing about it for me is that it's about all natural resources, wind, solar, not just you know, the commodities and mineral resources. And yeah, I'm glad that somebody's doing
it. Yeah. No, it's quite broad, to say the least, but it does they're basically the UNFC and the UNRMS, they're meant to work in tandem. Your UNFC is kind of, and Crisco reporting is basically state of play, what do we have at this point in time, and then the UNRMS is really trying to take that forward looking perspective, like, okay, so what do we do about it, and how do we make sure we get to where we want to be? I think that's probably the best way of trying to articulate it in a sentence, because it's quite big.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Eva. And yeah, I've got lots of messages coming in here saying that you've just provided us with clarity to an area that otherwise nobody had. We knew that something was going on, but we didn't know what it was. So that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Round of applause.
Thank you for having me.